If you love Review Mirror Chronicles and want to help us keep the show motoring along, honestly, the very best thing you can do, apart from listening, which I hope you're doing right now, is to spread the word. Tell a friend, tell your history-obsessed uncle, tell that neighbor who still remembers what they were doing when Elvis died. The stranger the history buff, the better. We're all in this together. Your support keeps the engine running, so thank you, and I hope you're ready for this episode. Hello, I'm Keith Ogden. You know, I've spent a lot of time wondering just why Diana, Princess of Wales, mattered so much to Britain, to the world, and in many ways, yes, to me. So picture this, London 1981, I'm sweating buckets as a apprentice piano mover, moving a baby grand up 8 flights of stairs. And outside, the streets are buzzing, the crowds are pressed up against the barriers. It's one of the hottest days of the year, and all eyes are on St. Paul's. Then fast forward to 1997, me in Hong Kong, the city's humming with news of Diana's death, the shockwaves rippling out just as fiercely as they did in London in 1981. So what is it about Diana? Why did she capture us all? Here's the thing. Before Diana, the royals were, frankly, a bit dull. Regal, yes, but about as approachable as the crown jewels themselves. Handshakes like icicles, smiles that barely cracked the surface. Then in comes Diana, a breath of fresh air, young, nervy, but utterly genuine. She'd blush, she'd stumble, she'd flash that shy, conspiratorial grin. And then suddenly, the monarchy looked almost, dare I say it, human. And let's not kid ourselves, we all love a good fairy tale. Diana's wedding to Charles, pure theatre. That dress, the carriage, that train trailing behind her for what seemed like miles. Just for a moment, Britain and half the globe got swept up in their magic, forgetting absolutely everything else. But here's what set Diana apart. She wasn't just content to just smile and wave from the palace balcony. She broke every royal rule in the book, visiting AIDS patients, hugging children, kneeling in the mud to comfort landmine victims. She didn't just shake their hands, she touched and changed their lives. And suddenly, royalty was less about distance and more about heart. Of course, she was no plaster saint. You know, her pain played out on the front pages almost daily. There was the messy marriage, the hounding paparazzi, and the struggles that she spoke about with incredible raw honesty. But that's exactly why the people loved her. She let us see the cracks. And in doing so, she let us see ourselves. Diana was living proof that you could actually be both glamorous and vulnerable, brave and broken, and still keep going. And then that night in Paris still gives me goosebumps till today. The whole world seemed to freeze. Grief, real grief, pouring out in the streets. Flowers stacked 10 feet high outside Kensington Palace. London hushed in mourning. It felt for a moment like the entire world was actually holding its breath. Diana in death became even bigger than Diana in life. A virtual symbol of everything we wanted the monarchy to be, if only it could let itself feel. So why Diana? Well, because she was our fairy tale, yes, but also our reality check. The princess who rebelled, the icon who felt pain, the woman who, in showing us her humility, her humanity, reminded us of our own. Now, if you're the kind of person who wants to know what's new on the Diana bookshelf, let's be honest, you probably are. You're in luck. Hot off the presses is Dianaworld, an obsession by Edward White. Came out in April 2025, and I've just got round to reading it and finishing it. And guess what? It's not your average Diana biography. There's no dry retelling of tiaras and tribulations. Instead, Edward White takes us right to the heart of the obsession. It's less about who was Diana and more about what happened to all of us the moment that she walked into the world spotlight. There are stories in here that you've probably never heard, even if you think you've heard it all. Stallone and Richard Gere nearly coming to blows at a party over Diana. Yes, really, this was a real thing. Diana sneaking into a London gay bar with Freddie Mercury, disguised and out for a night of mischief. It's a wild, heady journey through the phenomena that we now call Dianaworld. And as luck would have it, Edward White is with me today. Edward, welcome. Let's dive straight in. Your book isn't so much a biography of Diana as it is a study in the madness that followed. But before we go any further, can you tell us what the book is really about? And just as importantly, I think, what it isn't about.
Well, Dianaworld, as the book is titled, refers to this vast cultural universe that spins around Diana at the centre. And as you say, the book really, I envisage it more as a cultural history of Diana rather than a biography. And it's the story of how countless millions of people across the world became genuinely obsessed with Diana. The reasons for that are many. But in that sense, really, it's more of a story about us than it is about her. Even though Diana is in every paragraph on every page of the book, it's really about our connection to her more than her life story. And as such, actually, it's one of the things that I wanted to do with the book was to do something that is very rarely done and explore the connections that ordinary everyday people have with the royal family, with the institution of monarchy. It's always surprising to me that we've got this institution at the centre of our society, at the apex of our system of government, that we just kind of accept that it's there. And we talk about it as though it's this closed-off world that the royal family inhabit, and they get to decide how the institution should be run, essentially. And they're always taking the lead on the relationship with the public. So this book, to that extent, is trying to redress the balance a little bit. The book is full of figures that don't usually get a look in either books about Diana or books about the royal family in general. So I've trawled oral history archives and things like that and found a huge cast of characters, whether they be greasy spoon owners or professional Diana lookalikes, just everyday people from various walks of life who have some kind of connection with Diana.
And I'm sure we'll hear about some of those groups of people, some of those voices. But before we do that, you mentioned very interestingly that the rarefied quality attributed to Spencer, to the Spencer hemoglobin, hasn't stopped the rest of the world trying to claim Diana as their own flesh and blood. Before we start talking about that claiming, about the impact that she had, let's rewind to the first part of that sentence, because you mentioned the Spencer family. We should talk a little bit more about some of that and their background. Can you tell us about the Spencer family, and I suppose also about the rarefied quality that these sorts of families were experiencing at the time that Diana was born?
Yeah, well, the Spencer family is one of the sort of the grandest, oldest aristocratic families in England. I think that their great ancestral estate in Northamptonshire came into their possession in 1508. And it was in that time the family made a huge fortune, principally off, sheep farming, I think was the thing that really set them up. And in the Tudor period, they made a great killing and were elevated to an earldom. And there has been as I say, they were one of the most prominent aristocratic families for centuries. By the time they get to the 1960s, the aristocracy has been buffeted by the winds of change. The aristocracy's place in Britain had, obviously, they'd been financially diminished. Landowning was no longer the huge prize that it had been in the 19th century or before then. And so they were having to enter the real world, I suppose, as it were. And they were finding themselves subject to the same forces of social life that the rest of us had experienced and that they'd been insulated from for a great many years. And this, I suppose, comes through in the figure of Diana, in that her parents go through this very, very messy divorce, in which is kind of the origin story for Diana, really, in terms of her desire for security and love, etc., that leads her into perhaps slightly wrong-headed marriage to Prince Charles. And I think that, in the book, I posit that it's her experience of divorce as a young child that really connects her to the rest of the country. This is the first point of connection, something that I was interested in discovering when I went back to the original reporting on Diana from the early 1980s, was just how often the story of her parents' divorce was spoken about as integral to her personal story and to her connection with ordinary British people. 1969, the Divorce Reform Act comes in. It's a huge social change for the whole country. And by the time of the late 70s, when Diana is leaving school, she remarks that, most of a good number of her classmates had also experienced the divorce of their parents, which, 20 years earlier, this would have been a completely alien phenomenon to most people in the country.
You mentioned the press reporting of Diana and how that shaped our relationship with her as a nation. How pivotal is our understanding of Diana in terms of its framing through the press, even within her very, very early years?
I think the way that the press presented Diana to us is utterly crucial. I have this sense that she's kind of like, she appears as like a cultural prefab, is the way I think of it. She's a gift for tabloid editors. And there's a few reasons. The first is that, she emerges into the tabloid radar about a dozen years into the Murdoch revolution of Fleet Street. A couple of years before then, I think it's sort of 1978 or so, there's a famous article in one of Murdoch's papers that just says to the royal family, the era of deference is over. You shouldn't expect it and it won't be given. This characterises this extraordinarily aggressive approach towards Diana. So that's the first thing to bear in mind, that she was treated in the way that no other royal woman or person entering the royal family had ever been treated. And so they were never going to be able to get past that. That relationship was then set in stone from the beginning. The essential dynamics were there from the beginning. But also, I think that she's a gift to tabloid editors because she seems to embody so many different, really appealing character types from the moment she emerges. So she's the sort of the jolly hockey sticks, beautiful daughter of a very, very grand member of the aristocracy. But because of her background as a part-time nanny and a part-time nursery assistant, she's also presented to us as this sort of Mary Poppins figure, or a Cinderella figure, actually, because she does some part-time cleaning for her sister's friends. And she gets loaded with all these cultural archetypes from the very beginning, and it gives us a very, very strong framing for her. And it's something that she played up to as well. But I think really our relationship with her was very much set up by those early years of the tabloid press interest.
You talk a lot about the myths surrounding Diana in terms of her mythic status, that is. And I was thinking about that, and largely in terms of how she has gone on to become a mythic figure. But it sounds like even from her very early years that she was actually being framed in terms of stories and fairy tales and fictional characters. Is that fair to say?
I think it's exactly what was happening, yeah. I mean, there are so many of them. And there's even, to go off on a slight tangent, I'll come back in a second, but there's even that famous photograph of her where her legs are backlit, where she's holding two children outside the nursery school that she works at. And it's an extraordinary photograph because sort of from the waist up, she looks like kind of a young Mother Teresa type of figure. But from the waist down, she's presented to us as one of the early page 3 type of photographs that there were of where women were lit in very similar ways, the backlighting through a flimsy blouse or something like that, or a flimsy skirt in Diana's case. And so that's another of these archetypes, our cultural identities that are locked onto her. It astonished me to work out how excited people were. A particular section of people, I must say, not absolutely everybody, but there's a particular section of society that were genuinely excited that Diana was going to be marrying Prince Charles because she was going to be returning the royal family to its British roots. And I'd sort of, I'd not really been aware of that before I'd started researching this book. And somebody, I think it was either from Burke's Peerage or Debrett's or something like that, they worked out that any child that Charles and Diana had would be 58.8% British, which to me seems a staggeringly low percentage, considering that, if the Queen doesn't count as British, if Prince Charles doesn't count as British, or the King as he now is, then there's not much hope for the rest of us. But she's kind of loaded with all these precursors, and so a lot was made of her Stuart ancestry. She descended apparently from 5 different ways to Charles II. And there's no end of fairy tale stories attached to her, whether Cinderella or, and as I say, there's all the aristocratic stories that come from her own personal family background. It's often said of Marilyn Monroe, a figure to whom Diana is often compared, that Marilyn was a blank canvas upon which anybody could project their fantasies. With Diana, I think it's something different, and I think it's more apt to say that she is this storehouse of mythology and legend from which everybody can draw something that is relevant to themselves.
That's really interesting. You say in the book that never has anyone been so often seen, yet so rarely heard as Diana. Do you think that the focus on image, or I suppose the ability for people to ascribe their own meanings to it, is a key part to this mythic status of this process that you've actually described?
I think it's absolutely crucial to the way that Diana is received by people. And it's the great benefit of silence. I mean, when she appeared in public as a public figure, for years and years, hardly anybody heard her speak. I came across diary entries and letters and what have you from people that said they were quite surprised to hear her talk in the 1995 Panorama interview with Martin Bashir, because they realised they'd never heard her speak before. So she went for, huge, for most of her public life, it seemed, with most people not really having much idea of what she sounded like. And the women that did the voices for Spitting Image commented on this, that it was actually quite easy to do her voice, because you just did a generic posh woman's voice and it probably would be fine. And so that's the benefit of being silent, though, is that people can take from her what they find in her. There are some academics who have likened Diana's public profile to that of a silent film star's. And actually there's some really interesting work done by Professor Therese Davis about how Diana's performance, as she calls it, in the Panorama interview is like this French silent film star Falconetti, who gave this very famous performance as Joan of Arc in a silent film. It really plays to her strength that she is this powerfully present, visible figure, but there's always something kind of withdrawn about her, although many people believe that they can kind of discern what she's really thinking by reading her surface appearance, whether that's her very expressive eyes, the tilt of her head, or what she chooses to wear. So I think all those things are really important in helping people from very different backgrounds make some kind of connection with her.
To hone in on one aspect of that, the things that she wore, you write in the book that Diana's body in her public position was a precinct for designers to indulge their fantasies. Going back to the idea you raised previously about her becoming the canvas for stories about Britishness, specifically Englishness, and you specify that in the book to some extent, can you talk a little bit about how the things she wore changed the public perception and allowed for stories and narratives about national identity?
It's really interesting, I think, that is the issue of the fashion designing. The person that's most interesting, I think, in the story is in terms of building Diana's Englishness through her clothes is actually a French designer called Catherine Walker. Catherine Walker moved to England without any particular background in fashion. She said, at least, that she wasn't even especially interested in it, but she began designing maternity wear, and that's where Diana first wore her clothes. But over the years, it seems Catherine Walker got very interested in designing things that would kind of exhibit Diana's Englishness. And so when Diana was going on a tour of the Middle East, for instance, Catherine Walker would design particular outfits that she felt would strike some kind of symbolic note and would bring out, Diana as an Arthurian princess, or there'd be other outfits in particular colours that she thought would express the notion of an English garden in a desert landscape, because she was in the midst of this Middle Eastern tour. So these are important things. I think, though, as well, another thing that's going on with Diana is that she uses clothes to express her rebellion against Englishness. And that's certainly how it's seen by a lot of people in her orbit, or, a lot of her fans. So there's this phase that I'm sure people listening will probably remember, where Diana started wearing a lot of American clothing in a kind of an almost completely over-the-top sort of way, where she'd be wearing cowboy boots with denim jeans, American football sweatshirts, and a baseball cap. So I think that she did a lot of that kind of deliberately in order to express her desire to break away, to some extent, from the constraints of the royal family.
So she's not just this blank canvas. She does have the agency and the power to be able to control, to some extent, the messages that she's conveying.
To some extent, she was a shrewd and pretty sharp, calculating person, and she did definitely manage to construct her own image to quite a large degree. That said, I think some people have gone a bit over the top with it. I know it's been suggested that Diana once wore a pair of red high heels because she wanted to suggest that she was like Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, and that she desperately wanted to be able to click her heels together and disappear. And I think that's probably going a bit too far. But on the whole, yes, I think she was very conscious. The thing that I always think about with this question is the way that her status as a mother was projected. And it's a really good example of the ways in which she, to some extent, forged her own path and consciously, deliberately did things to express her own identity and her break from tradition. But there's also plenty of examples of these other identities that we've been talking about being foisted upon her. So, for instance, the historian called Colleen Deeney has done some really interesting work comparing Diana's official portraiture, where she's with her two young sons, to portraiture that was done of Queen Alexandra, or as she was before, Princess Alexandra, back in the 19th century. And if you look at those images, they are almost identical, where Diana is presented as this very, very traditional Victorian mother. Yet at the same time, there are other photographs of Diana, as a mother that are utterly different and make her look like a very, very contemporaneous sort of a figure. I suppose maybe the most famous examples would be things like Diana running barefoot at the boys' school sports day, or her, taking them on the log flume at Alton Towers, or whichever theme park it was they went to. I talk of her in the book as being a cut and shut princess. And cut and shut basically refers to this practice where people take two smashed up cars and they take the working bits from those cars and stick them together to form a new car. And that's kind of the rough analogy or metaphor that I use to talk about Diana in this, that she was capable of holding at the same time two extremely different sets of identities. So she was both the Victorian mother, but also the post-feminist mother, some people claim that she was just out and out a feminist, which I think is a more complicated argument to sustain, but it's one that certainly some people have attempted to.
One aspect, I think an important aspect of this that we've not talked about, is her gender, her femininity. Can you talk a little bit about the ways in which Diana represents ideals and notions of femininity at the time, or I suppose posed a challenge to at least some of them?
I think there's the thing that I always think about with this question is the way that her status as a mother was projected. And it's a really good example of the ways in which she, to some extent, forged her own path and consciously, deliberately did things to express her own identity and her break from tradition. But there's also plenty of examples of these other identities that we've been talking about being foisted upon her. So, for instance, the historian called Colleen Deeney has done some really interesting work comparing Diana's official portraiture, where she's with her two young sons, to portraiture that was done of Queen Alexandra, or as she was before, Princess Alexandra, back in the 19th century. And if you look at those images, they are almost identical, where Diana is presented as this very, very traditional Victorian mother. Yet at the same time, there are other photographs of Diana, as a mother that are utterly different and make her look like a very, very contemporaneous sort of a figure. I suppose maybe the most famous examples would be things like Diana running barefoot at the boys' school sports day, or her, taking them on the log flume at Alton Towers or whichever theme park it was they went to. I talk of her in the book as being a cut and shut princess. And cut and shut basically refers to this practice where people take two smashed up cars and they take the working bits from those cars and stick them together to form a new car. And that's kind of the rough analogy or metaphor that I use to talk about Diana in this, that she was capable of holding at the same time two extremely different sets of identities. So she was both the Victorian mother, but also the post-feminist mother. Some people claim that she was just out and out a feminist, which I think is a more complicated argument to sustain, but it's one that certainly some people have attempted to.
And let's just take a quick break, and we'll be back in a second with part 2. Altadomus is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much, much more than that. When you sign up with Altadomus, you become part of a larger community. A community that actually cares about you and your family in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. For more information, go talk to TG or WhatsApp him on +60 12 49 37 270 or visit their website penangmyhome.com. And we're back. To dive into what is a central complex question, does the ability that she has to hold these contradictory, these multiple images, these narratives together in the same person, does that say something about her as a person or Britain at the very specific time that this was happening?
I think that the idea of the cut and shut princess, of Diana holding these different things together, probably says a lot about what we expect of the royal family at that particular moment in history. I think one of the reasons that we became obsessed with Diana is because at a moment in the 1980s and 1990s, we were in the foothills of this creeping decay of trust in grand public institutions. And Diana became somebody, I think, that filled the gaps. And especially in terms of her public engagement, she had this, she did have her own abilities. She had these tremendous personal qualities of empathy and compassion and fantastic social skills that allowed her to engage with people differently. But at the same time, people in this country in particular still looked to the royal family to offer something that I think they felt that we couldn't get from politics or organised religion. And Diana, in her unique way, I suppose you could say, Diana did manage to offer a type of public engagement that seemed to attend to some of our spiritual needs without her being an explicitly religious figure or an explicitly political one.
I want to go back to a very specific point you made earlier, which was the comparison between Diana and Alexandria. In what other ways were these two women similar, or what parallels can we actually draw between them?
Yeah, again, I have to give credit to Colleen Deeney for doing the work on this. But yes, in terms of their engagement with members of the public, there seems to have been a lot of similarities. And I doubt very much that these were similarities that Diana was consciously aware of. But again, I think it's partly because in her role as Princess of Wales, it's very easy to fit her into her predecessors' narratives. So there's a story, for instance, of Princess Alexandra going to visit sick people in hospital, and apparently I don't know what the injury was, but Alexandra had an injury to her leg, and she was meeting a man who had a terrible industrial accident, and he was lying in bed, and she did this thing of raising her leg up onto a table to show him, well, look, if I can rehabilitate my leg, then you can do the same with yours. And it was seen as an extraordinary thing to do, that she was breaking royal protocol and reaching out to an ordinary person in their time of need, which has kind of striking similarities with that famous idea of Diana of doing exactly that, of going into hospitals, etc., and talking to ill people. Most famously, of course, when she went to the Middlesex Hospital and shook hands with patients with HIV. So yeah, there are strong similarities, it seems, at least in terms of the reputations of Diana and her predecessor Alexandra.
There's a line in the book that I think is really interesting, and I wanted to sort of focus in on that. You say that throughout Diana's adult life, a reoccurring feature that appeared in Britain's women's magazines was one of the image on alternate reality in which Diana had never become the Princess of Wales, or on the flip side of that coin, in which she decided to pack it all in and turn herself into a normal woman. It was a rare reversal of celebrity media coverage. This is really interesting and I think speaks a lot to the things that we've talked about. Could you explain what you actually meant when you said that?
I discovered in several women's magazines in the 1980s there would be features about what Diana would do were she a normal person. You know, if Diana had not married into the royal family, or as we get later on into her story, if Diana ever left the royal family, you know, once the tensions with Charles became public knowledge, these articles would speculate about what else she could do. So some people were saying, they would say, well, maybe she'll go back to being a teacher, or, you know, she'll go into nursing. And then other people would say, no, she's clearly going to get her own chat show, or she'll move to America. There was a possibility at one point, by the way, that somebody sent her a script for a sequel to The Bodyguard. Kevin Costner, I think, actually was the person. And so that was one of the possibilities. And I was just really struck by this. You know, it's the idea that there's this fascination with the idea that you know, Diana is one of us, but she's somehow managed to slip off into this rarefied world of the royal family. And it allows us to imagine what our lives would be like if the same thing happened to us. Or if Diana, who is now this extraordinary, mythological almost creature, if she were to suddenly leave it, what would she do? My favourite example of this, though, doesn't so much come from the women's magazines. It's from this novel that was published in 1994 by an American author called Peter Lefcourt. And it's basically the idea, it's a satire, but in it, Diana decides she's going to ditch the royal family, and she takes her sons, moves them to California, gives them crew cuts, dresses them in Nike trainers and Bart Simpson t-shirts, and she gets a job. She buys a McDonald's franchise in this shopping mall in California. But this was a constant theme of the coverage of Diana, basically people just fascinated by the prospect that she might one day come back to Earth and be amongst us mere mortals.
We talked a little bit already about how Diana possesses this ability to speak to a whole range of different groups in society. And I wanted to go through some of those examples, starting, I suppose, with America, which is an example that we've just spoken about. Could you talk a little bit about how Diana, how her image and her mythic status, I suppose, was received on the other side of the Atlantic?
For me, this is perhaps the most interesting aspect of the whole book, I think. That Diana's relationship with the United States is utterly crucial to the fact of her immense fame at the time she lived, but her enduring fame in the last 28 years. There was this sense, I think, it's quite a complicated backstory, but there is this huge interest in Diana in America. There is this sort of allure for princesses and royalty in general, but particularly this figure of the princess. It has a huge cultural currency in America. And Diana came along at a particular moment when it was just a perfect kind of cultural moment, when there was the technology available to make Diana what I think of as the first consumerist princess. And it's consumerist first in the way that we are able to carry out a relationship with her, that we have this is the era of colour supplements for newspapers is just beginning, the foothills of satellite television, of VHS technology, etc., of fast fashion. So people can kind of form a relationship with a princess in a way that nobody else had ever been able to do. And it's very much a consumerist relationship. You know, you can own, experience, and even inhabit Diana in some sense. And this is a really important part of her connection to the United States. But Diana herself is also seen as a consumerist figure. And in particular, there's this thing about her, this association between her and McDonald's comes up over and over again. And I noticed in the research that a lot of people, when they were asked, in Vox Pops and that kind of thing, or on internet forums, immediately after Diana's death, American people would often say, well, she was just wonderful. Not only was she a gorgeous and classy lady, but she was also just like us. I saw her take those children to McDonald's. And she I think she lived her life in a way that American people connected to. And it really surprised me to find out that it wasn't just Americans who thought of her as basically being an American princess. It was also people outside the United States. So I talked to a couple of people, I interviewed a couple of people for the book, American fans of Diana's. And they said to me that they basically thought that she was like the embodiment of the American dream. I mean, one man said to me that the inspiring thing about Diana's story is that she shows that anybody can become a member of the royal family, which obviously isn't true. I mean, she started off as Lady Diana Spencer. That's why she married into the royal family. Her story as it's conveyed in the United States is completely different, and I found that fascinating. But I also came across people from outside the US talking about Diana and who said that, well, no, she was an American princess. That's why we liked her, because in this sort of post-war cultural world where the United States is the cultural lingua franca, they didn't think of her, a lot of people at least, didn't really think of her as being British or English. She seemed like an American. And so it's her Americanness that I think, even though it's imagined, it's certainly she's no more of an American than the rest of us who live in, the Western world. But it's her perceived Americanness that I think is the real key to her being such a gigantically famous figure.
And it wasn't just American culture that she was able to tap into touch with. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about this and about some of the other people of various ethnic backgrounds who felt an affinity to or a connection to her. Can you talk about some of the case studies from your book that explored that aspect of things?
Yeah, Diana basically cut across, it seems, national, ethnic, religious divides with the kind of ease that no other figure, except maybe someone like Nelson Mandela, has ever managed to do. I mean, it is really pretty extraordinary. The one case that I investigated quite a lot and go into a lot of detail in the book about is Diana's connection with South Asian people, in particular Pakistan, but other parts of the Indian subcontinent as well. And of course, Diana had some kind of personal connection with that, with her boyfriend Hasnat Khan, he was the last man that she was in a serious relationship with. And so she formed a close personal relationship with Pakistan. I interviewed people, Shazia Mirza, the stand-up comedian, for instance. I spoke to her about this, and she told me that basically people in that community, at least in her community, in the part of Birmingham that she grew up in, people were very heavily invested in Diana, because that she seemed to lead a life that had kind of grandiose parallels to their own. She said to me that basically when a lot of South Asian people look at the royal family, they see family structures like their own. It's very hierarchical, and also, Diana seemed to have been engaged in what to them appeared to be an arranged marriage. And so there were lots of parallels, and especially for recent immigrants to Britain back in the 1980s, it was a kind of validation. This is what Shazia was saying to me. Well, look what Diana is doing. Look what the royals are doing. That's our lives. And it seemed like an affirmation of their own cultural backgrounds. And so that was very powerful for them. And to the extent that Shazia said that I think it's her mother dressed in quite traditional Pakistani clothing, I believe. But when Diana had a new outfit, she would go out and she'd try and find the material from that outfit to turn into a sari, which I just think is a brilliant encapsulation of the kind of effect that Diana had and the ways in which people were able to take something from her and refashion it for themselves.
Another group I want to get into a little bit, and we've already mentioned the famous stories of and the images of Diana kind of shaking hands with patients with HIV/AIDS. Could you talk a little bit about the relationship that she had with the gay community in Britain? And I suppose also some of the tensions and the contradictions that were inherent in her doing that.
Yeah, Diana was kind of embraced, I think, by a lot of gay people as being kind of an ally or an icon. There's a particular parallel I draw in the book between Diana's interview in her Panorama interview. It kind of has a parallel to other sorts of interviews of the time, such as George Michael's one, which is so it's essentially like Diana doing a coming out interview in the Panorama in 1995, as much as it is a kind of a whistleblowing interview. She became a very heavily associated with the gay community. But I think a lot of gay people found this quite an uncomfortable parallel. There's an absolutely fascinating resource that I drew on that's called the National Lesbian and Gay Survey. After Diana's death, they asked their respondents to write in and give their take on Diana's death and how they felt and what they felt it meant to gay people. And there was only about a dozen people that responded to it. But each one of them is totally different from all the others. You know, there are 12 or so completely different responses. And some people were absolutely horrified that Diana should be considered to be an important person in gay life at all. Because, you know, she's this ultra privileged. She's basically a poster girl for heteronormative couples. You know, you can't get straighter than Princess Diana. And there was just sort of a sense of irritation and I think insult that she should be considered to be, you know, an important part of gay people's lives because she knew nothing about the experience of their lives. Other people at the same time felt like she was, you know, their most important ally, and that she took the discrimination that gay people faced as part of their daily lives, and she did an awful lot to kind of combat it, and not just because of her involvement with the HIV issue, but because she was known to be friends with gay people, and she was seen to be a great ally. Other people that wrote into this survey, they suggested that what was great about her is that she actually cut across all of these kinds of identities and that everybody could kind of find their own Diana, whether you were gay, straight or anything else.
This is a story that is understandably overshadowed by and to some extent defined by the tragedy of her ending. And I really don't want to get too much into that tragedy, but what I want to do is talk about whether or not the things that we've talked about today help us understand that particular cultural moment in 1997, and also whether you think some of the current traits, some of the stories you've described, help us understand how we as a society actually came to that moment.
I first got the idea for doing this exploration of Diana's reputation during the COVID lockdown, and it was because we just come through this period of, you know, these long wranglings over Brexit. And then immediately once that was finished, we were plunged into this very strange time, this peculiar atmosphere that was obviously spreading right across the nation. It reminded me very strongly of things that I thought and felt during 1997. I was 15 when Diana died, and I remember it really vividly. I think of kind of her death. It's almost like it's a turning point in my life, not because I was particularly attached to Diana. I wasn't. I still don't have particularly strong views about her as a person. You know, I'm not personally connected to her. But I became aware that she was this extraordinarily potent figure for whatever reasons. When I went back to investigate, you know, what was happening in that week, Diana Week, as you could call it, as it was sometimes referred to at the time as that, it became really obvious to me that there was the discourse around the mourning for Diana, the public mourning for Diana, was really strikingly similar to the kind of discourse that we'd had just coming out of Brexit. In that there were two groups of people, you know, people who, this is how it's portrayed in the media anyway. It's not actually probably quite this pat. But we were told there are two groups of people. There was one that was mourning Diana excessively and one that couldn't understand what on earth all the fuss was about. And that neither of these two groups of people could understand the other. And they felt like they didn't understand the country they were living in. You know, how could you be so overwrought, or how could you be so heartless, that kind of thing. And it is as if national identity, Britishness itself, seemed to be on the line, because there were some people those who felt that the crowds in London had lost their minds, they would over and over say things like, well, they're acting like this is what happened in Nazi Germany, or this is what you find in North Korea. Boris Johnson described it, I think, as a Latin American carnival of grief. I think it was David Starkey who said he found the scenes reminiscent of Sicily. It seemed to be every critic of the morning was criticising it on the basis of this isn't Britain anymore. We've lost our national identity. We've lost something deep and profound and important about ourselves. At the same time, the people who were mourning were looking at, often criticising the royals for being these kind of Teutonic, unemotionless, Germanic people. There's been a long-running joke about how the British royal family isn't really British, they're Germans. And one of the reasons Diana was kind of celebrated when she entered the royal family is that she was British, she wasn't a German, and she was going to be restoring the British family to the rightful custodians, i.e. the British people. And so I think in that week, a lot of those sorts of things came out. Diana's importance as a symbol of British tradition, but also the future world that Britain was heading in, they really came to the fore. The final thing to say about that is that it was noted at the time of the mourning, it was noted by lots of people that, especially the young people who were mourning, seemed to embody a new Britain, that it was definitively the case that we were heading on a different path because these young people were multi-ethnic, a lot of them were gay, and they were all, it was kind of seemed to be presumed by certain writers anyway, certain commentators, that they were all pro-European. And the lesson of Diana seemed to be Britain needs to accept its place in the new world, in the emerging European Union. We need to embrace our Europeanness, leave behind the stuffy traditions of the past, of Britain and empire and the monarchy and all that, embrace something different. And that's what Tony Blair was selling basically in 1997. But you fast forward to the end of the Brexit process, the beginning of the COVID era, and all that stuff was completely gone. And so I think that it was fascinating how quickly those presumptions about the kind of Britain that Diana embodied, how quickly those presumptions evaporated in the last few years.
And I guess it remains fascinating that a single person can embody that narrative, the identity of a nation of different people all at the same time.
Yeah, it does. Although I do think that there is a huge amount written about Diana that is completely over the top and hyperbolic, it is true that she has managed to do something in the mere fact of her being and of her presence as a public figure. She's done something that nobody else has really been able to do, in be a focus for all those different constituencies in British life.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was Edward White's portrait of Diana. And it lingers in the mind, a sense of possibility, the shimmer of a life, I think both dazzling and difficult, poised between fairy tale and modern tragedy. And maybe, in the end, that's what keeps us coming back to Diana. Not the scandals, not the headlines, not even the famous photographs, but the contradictions at the center of her story. Here was a woman born into privilege, yet who became the voice of the unheard. A woman who rewrote the rulebook in many ways, who made Buckingham Palace feel just a little bit less distant, a little bit more real. Her struggles, played out for all the world to see, became mirrors for our own hopes and our own heartbreaks. She was a public figure who, in the loneliest of moments, was at her most human. For those of us watching from the outside, Diana was always more than the sum of her parts. She was a style icon, a charity champion, a loving mother, a rebel, and sometimes just a young woman searching for kindness in a world that can be anything but kind. I think the genius of Edward White's biography is that he doesn't try to reduce her to a single story. He lets her be complicated because she was. He lets her be contradictory. And in that way, he gives us back a Diana who is at once legendary and heartbreakingly real. In the years since her death, Diana's legacy has only grown. She changed how we think about the royal family, how we talk about mental health, how we look at fame. She left behind, I think, more than just memories. She left behind a challenge. And I think that challenge is to be a little bit braver, a little bit more open-hearted, a little bit more willing to see the person behind the image. And maybe that's where we should leave her. Not as a martyr, definitely not as a victim, but as someone who reminded us, however briefly, of the possibilities of empathy and connection. Someone who, for all her flaws and fragilities, believed that the world could be better, it could be softer, and it could absolutely be kinder. So as we close this chapter, we're left with a question that it's as old as history itself. What is it that makes someone truly unforgettable? In Diana's case, maybe it's not just what she did or even what she endured, but the way that she made us feel. The way she made us believe, if only for a moment, that fairy tales could come true. And that, even if they don't, there's still a kind of grace to be found in the very trying. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me on this journey through Diana's life. If her story teaches us anything, it's that being seen, truly seen, is a gift and a responsibility. And perhaps that is the legacy that matters most of all. Bye for now.